Most people see a skyscraper as a monument to human ambition. I see it as a stack of lies held together by gravity and high, tensile steel. I was hanging 40 stories up in a window washing rig, the city wind whistling through the nylon straps of my safety harness when I saw him, through the triple-paned glass. My brother Julian was raising a crystal flute of champagne. He looked perfect in his charcoal suit, basking in the warm glow of the mayor's praise. He didn't see me. Nobody looks at the man cleaning the glass. I reached out to steady my rig, and my gloved hand brushed a hairline fracture in the decorative mullion. It was a tiny, jagged spiderweb in the metal. The tower was barely finished, and it was already failing. The load-bearing math was screaming, but Julian was just smiling. The math never lies, Julian, I whispered, though he couldn't hear me over the altitude's roar. You can frame a man, but you can't frame physics. I felt the silver drafting compass in my pocket, its sharp point pressing against my thigh. It was the only thing I had left from my old life, the life Julian stole when he sent me to prison for his own crimes. I watched him laugh, knowing that the foundation he stood on was as rotten as his soul. Before I tell you how I tore his legacy down, please hit the like button and subscribe if you're enjoying the story. It helps me share these experiences. Now, let's go back to the day the first crack appeared. I don't see the world like you do. Most people look at a bridge and see a way across the water. I see the invisible lines of force pushing down into the concrete. My father called it the eye. He said it was a gift, but lately, it feels like a haunting. You're doing it again, Elias. My boss at the window, washing crew said to me this morning. Staring at the joints like, you're trying to perform surgery on the building. Just spray the soap and move the rig. I'm just checking the tension, I told him. You're a window washer. He grunted. Not a doctor. Act like it. 3 years ago, I was the chief architect at Thorne and Sons. I had a corner office and a name that meant something. Now, my office is a blue bucket and a squeegee. I spend my days scrubbing the grime off buildings I used to dream about. It's a long way down from the top. I'm 36 years old, and I'm a ghost. People look right through me. Maybe it's the work clothes, or maybe it's the way I carry myself, like a man who knows exactly how much weight a human heart can bear before it collapses. I used to believe that if the math was right, the world would be fair. I was a fool. Physics is the only thing that's honest. People are just chaotic variables that ruin every beautiful design. It is the only truth I trust. My family was a tripod. My father, Arthur Thorne, was the foundation. He built this city, but by the time I entered the firm, his mind was fraying. Elias, look at this cantilever. He whispered to me during my first month. It's breathing. Can you feel it? It's just the thermal expansion, Dad, I replied. No. He said, his eyes clouded. It's the city's heart. Don't let Julian sell the heart for parts. Then there was my older brother. He was the facade. He had the silver hair and a smile that could sell a swamp. Ali, you worry too much about the bones, he would say, adjusting his silk tie in my office mirror. Nobody cares about the beams if the glass is pretty enough to make them feel rich. Those beams are why they stay alive, to feel rich, I'd answer. Eleanor Thorne, our mother, was the real CEO. She sat at the head of the dinner table like a queen. To her we were assets. Appearances are everything, she told me once. Julian is the face our clients trust. You are the hands that build that trust. Without both, the name is just dust. Do you understand your role, Elias? I understand, I said. I'm the one who makes sure he doesn't fall through the floor. I accepted it back then. I didn't realize that in a family like mine, if you aren't the face, you're the sacrifice. My mother always chose the winning horse, and in her eyes, Julian was the only one with a chance. The transit hub was the jewel in our crown. Sarah Vance was my lead engineer, and the person I thought I'd spend my life with. You're over-engineering it again, she laughed, sitting across from me at the diner. This atrium could survive a Category 5 hurricane. I don't design for Sarah, I told her. I design for will, because eventually the storm always comes. Do you trust the welds on the east wing? I trust you, she said softly. I always have. A week later, my brother walked into my office. He threw a report on my desk. The grade 80 steel is too expensive, he said. Swap it for grade 60. We'll save $4 million. The math doesn't support that, I countered. The stress fatigue will hit 40% in 5 years. People could die. Is that worth the 4 million? Don't be so dramatic, he sighed. The Thorn name is built on profit. It's a business, not a science experiment. Are you going to sign off? Or do I have to find an architect who isn't so rigid? I won't sign a lie, I said. He just smiled. You won't have to. I'll take care of it. I thought he meant he would talk to the board. I thought he was on my side, fighting for the integrity of our father's legacy. Instead, he went straight to our mother, and together, they drafted the blueprint for my destruction. I was too busy calculating loads to see the trap. The air in the courtroom was thick with the scent of old paper and indifference. I could hear the clock on the back wall ticking, each second a hammer on a nail. My public defender was staring at his notepad, probably wondering what he was having for lunch. The courtroom was a masterclass in acoustics. Every footfall of the bailiff sounded like a gavel strike against my skull. I sat at the defense table, my hands trembling under the heavy mahogany. Across the aisle, Julian sat with his chin up, looking every bit the grieving brother. Call Eleanor Thorne to the stand, the prosecutor said. My mother walked with a grace that was surgically precise. She didn't look at me. She looked at the judge, at the jury, at the gallery, everywhere but at the son who had spent his weekends fixing the plumbing in her estate. Mrs. Thorne, the prosecutor began, holding up a stack of forged offshore bank records. Did your son Elias ever express financial distress to you? She adjusted her pearl necklace. Her voice was as cold as a winter morning. She sighed. He did. Elias has always been impulsive. He told me he'd made mistakes with his gambling. He said he needed the 4 million from the transit hub to make things right. I tried to help him, but the debt was too deep. Liar! I shouted. The word tore out of my throat before I could stop it. The judge's gavel slammed down. Order, one more outburst, Mr. Thorne, and you will be removed. I looked at Julian. He was leaning back, his hands steepled. He wasn't even hiding it anymore. He gave me a tiny, imperceptible nod. It was the nod of an architect who had just watched his last rival be demolished. I have no more questions, the prosecutor said. My lawyer didn't even stand up. He knew the load was too heavy. The foundation was gone. I realized then that the truth didn't matter in a room built on lies. It was over. I felt the air leave the room, replaced by the cold weight of prison. They led me out through the back hallway, the linoleum floors polished to a mirror finish. The handcuffs felt like ice against my wrists. Julian was waiting by the exit, his expensive cologne cutting through the smell of floor wax. Wet, he told the guards. Everyone in this city knew the man who built the skyscrapers. They stepped back, giving us a moment of stage privacy. Why? I asked. My voice was a dry rasp. Why me, Julian? I designed that hub. I gave you everything. He stepped closer, close enough that I could see the tiny, perfect pores on his nose. Because the firm needed a hero and a villain, Eli, and you were always better at the math than the marketing. People are going to die when those beams fail. I hissed. The hub is fine, he said, patting my shoulder as if we were at a Sunday brunch. The city won't let it fail. They'll just keep repairing it with public funds. But you're the structural error we had to correct. It's for the good of the firm. Mom agrees. It's better this way. You're a monster, I whispered. No, he smiled. I'm a thorn. You're just the guy who used to work for us. The sunlight hitting the lobby's floor was blinding, a sharp contrast to the dim fluorescent tubes of the courtroom. I felt like a bug under a microscope, pinned down for all to see. I'll see you in hell, Julian, I said. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing with the confidence of a man who had never been told no. I watched the back of his suit disappear into the sunlight, and for the first time in my life, I felt the math in my head turn cold. 6 months after my release, the world had moved on. The transit hub was already showing its first cracks, patched over by city crews in the dead of night. I was living in a studio that smelled like damp cardboard, working for a crew that didn't ask for my ID. I was walking home through the alley behind our old firm when I saw the dumpster. Hey, you find any gold in there? A scavenger asked from the shadows. Paper, I replied, pulling a roll from the heap. Just a bunch of expensive, worthless paper. I unrolled it against the brick wall. It was the plans for the Legacy Tower. I squinted, my eyes scanning the technical specifications. There it was. Subsection 4.2, he was doing it again. He'd specified grade 80 steel for the primary supports, but the procurement notes stapled to the back, signed in his messy scrawl, ordered grade 60. The load calculations were based on the higher strength, but the actual metal being poured was cheap scrap. He was cutting corners on a 60-story tower. He wasn't just stealing money, he was building a vertical graveyard. He was gambling with thousands of lives to pad his account and keep our mother in her pearls. "You're consistent, Julian," I muttered, the paper crinkling in my grip. "I'll give you that. You haven't changed a bit." I looked up at the skeletal frame of the tower rising into the smog. It looked like a rib cage waiting to be filled with the unsuspecting. I realized then that my prison sentence wasn't the end of my story. It was the curing process. I was stronger, and I knew exactly where the deepest cracks were going to form. I returned to the Legacy Tower the following Monday, not as an architect, but as the man who clears the smudges off the sky. My rig was a rattling cage of steel cables and rusted pulleys. The wind at 500 feet doesn't just blow, it pushes against you like a physical hand, trying to peel you off the glass. It's a sensory overload. The smell of industrial soap, the screech of metal on metal, and the terrifying view of the street below, where cars look like tiny, colorful beetles. I had 12 strain gauge sensors hidden in my utility belt, disguised as rolls of industrial tape. Every time the rig descended past a primary node, the points where Julian's cheap steel met the concrete core, I reached out and pressed a sensor into the recessed gasket of the window frame. These tiny devices were my eyes. They measured the microscopic shifts in the building skeleton, translating tension into data. "What are you doing over there, Thorne?" My partner, Miller, yelled over the roar of the wind. "Just checking the seal." I shouted back, my heart hammering against my ribs. "The glass is vibrating too much. It feels wrong." "The wind's at 30 knots, kid! Everything vibrates in this altitude!" Miller spat a stream of tobacco juice into the void. "Just keep scrubbing and stop thinking. We're behind schedule and the foreman is a shark." I nodded and wiped the soap away, watching the digital readout on my phone. The numbers were already deep in the red. The building was under more tension than the blueprints allowed. It was a ticking clock made of glass and greed. I felt a grim satisfaction. I wasn't just a janitor anymore. I was a doctor monitoring a patient with a terminal heart condition. I waited for Sarah outside the site office after her shift ended. The sky was turning a bruised purple, and the floodlights were kicking on, casting long, skeletal shadows across the construction yard. She came out wearing a hard hat with the Thorn logo on it, looking tired but still sharp in her steel-toed boots. When she saw me leaning against the chain-link fence, she stopped dead in her tracks. Her face went pale, then hard as granite. "Elias," she said. Her voice was flat, devoid of the warmth I'd remembered for 3 years. "You shouldn't be here. Julian has security watching for you. He's obsessed." "I'm sure he does," I said, pushing off the fence. "He's a man with a lot to hide." I saw the steel orders, Sarah. "You're the lead engineer on this project. How could you let him use grade 60 scrap instead of the structural steel we specified?" She looked away, her eyes scanning the parking lot for anyone watching us. She looked like a caged bird. Then I saw it. The late afternoon sun caught a diamond on her left hand. It wasn't just any ring. It was the Thorne family heirloom, a vintage emerald cut that our mother had promised to Julian's bride. "You're engaged to him." I felt like I'd been hit by a wrecking ball. The air left my lungs. "After everything he did to me, after he stole the life we were building together and threw me in a cage. Things changed while you were gone, Elias," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The firm was falling apart. Julian. Julian stepped up. He saved my career when the board wanted me gone." "He didn't save you." I spat. "He bought you. He used the money he stole from the transit hub to pay for your silence." "Go away, Elias," she said, tears finally welling in her eyes. "Just go before you get us both killed." She turned to walk toward her car, but I grabbed her arm. Not hard, just enough to stop her. She didn't scream. She leaned in close, her breath hot and smelling of coffee against my ear. "Stop acting like a martyr," she hissed, her eyes darting around. "And look in my jacket pocket." I pulled back, completely confused. I watched as she fumbled with her keys, then purposefully dropped her jacket on the pavement. As I leaned down to pick it up, I felt a small, cold object slide into my palm. A USB drive. "I've been waiting for you to find me for 3 months," she whispered, her back to me. "I didn't think you'd come back as a window washer, you absolute idiot." I looked at her, my anger replaced by a sudden, dizzying hope. "Sarah, what is this?" "The ring is a prop, Elias, a shackle. My career isn't saved, I'm a hostage. He won't let me quit, because I know too much about the Foundation shifts. That drive has the encrypted logs from the procurement server. Everything he hid from the auditors is on there. The bribes, the fake inspections, the offshore transfers. It's all there." "Why didn't you go to the police?" I asked. "Because Julian owns the chief of police," she said, her voice shaking with fear. "I needed someone who knew the math. Someone he couldn't intimidate with a badge. I needed you to find the flaw I couldn't prove." She took her jacket back, wiped her eyes, and walked away without another word. I stood there, the flash drive clutched in my hand like a holy relic of vengeance. The server room was located in the second basement, guarded by a biometric lock that Sarah had given me the bypass code for. I slipped inside at midnight, the room humming with the sound of 1,000 cooling fans. The air was frigid and smelled of ozone and static. I found the central HVAC controller, the brain of the entire building. This was where Julian's secret ledger was hidden, buried in the firmware where no auditor would ever think to look. I plugged in the drive. The screen flickered, columns of data scrolling past in a green blur. There it was, a file titled Legacy Adjustment Zilla 1. I opened it and felt a cold fury settle in my gut. It was a spreadsheet of human lives. Julian had paid off 3 city inspectors to sign off on the foundation despite a 12-inch shift in the soil. He'd used the $4 million he stole from the transit hub to pay for the cover-up here. He was building on a literal lie. "You didn't just frame me, Julian," I whispered to the empty humming room. "You turned me into the only man who can prove you're a murderer." I downloaded the files, my fingers flying across the keyboard with the precision of a pianist. As the progress bar reached 100%, I heard a sharp sound behind me. The heavy steel door clicked shut. I looked at the security monitor. A man in a dark suit was standing in the hallway, his hand on the magnetic lock. He wasn't a guard. He was one of Julian's personal fixers. I had the truth, but I was trapped in a room with no windows and very little air. I didn't panic. I scanned the ceiling and found the fire suppression nozzle. These rooms weren't protected by water. They used CO2 to starve fires of oxygen. I pulled my multi-tool from my belt and jammed it into the manual release valve. "Enjoy the deep breath," I muttered. A deafening hiss filled the room as the freezing gas erupted. The pressure differential slammed the door outward for a fraction of a second, breaking the magnetic seal. I threw my weight against it, slipping through the gap before the fixer could react to the white cloud of gas blinding him. I disappeared into the service tunnel, my lungs burning, but my hand still tight on the drive. I barely made it back to my studio, my lungs still burning with the sharp scent of dust and the lingering cold of the CO2 gas. I sat in the dark, staring at the flash drive. It felt like a high-voltage wire in my hand. I knew I could take this evidence to the district attorney, but I also knew how the city worked. Julian's payroll was a web that caught everyone from judges to journalists. My word was the word of a disgraced convict, and his was the word of a visionary. I realized that the only way to stop a monster like him was to destroy the cage he'd built for himself. This wasn't a matter of law anymore. It was a matter of structural integrity. I had to dismantle his legacy piece by piece, even if it meant becoming the villain he'd always claimed I was. The decision felt like a cold stone settling in my gut, heavy, cold, and permanent. I met Sarah at a crumbling industrial pier 3 nights later. The fog was a thick, wet blanket that smelled of salt, rot, and old engine oil. The distant sound of a foghorn groaned like a dying beast. "You're asking me to commit professional suicide, Elias," she said, her fingers trembling as she struggled to light a cigarette. The orange glow of the lighter illuminated the fear in her eyes. "I'm asking you to help me save 5,000 lives," I replied, my voice as steady as the pilings beneath us. "Julian's pride is a structural flaw that can't be patched. If we don't act now, that building will eventually be a vertical cemetery. If we get caught, we're going to prison, both of us. You know he won't hesitate to bury us under the same concrete he's been skimming from. I've already been in the dark, Sarah. It's not nearly as cold as living a lie in a charcoal suit. She looked out at the black, churning water for a long time. The wind whipped her hair across her face, masking the tears I knew were coming. I'll give you the back door access to the vibration sensors. I can bypass the manual overrides from my terminal during the gala. But if people get hurt in the panic, if there's a stampede, I'll never forgive myself. Neither will you. I won't let them get hurt. I just need them to see the truth of what he's built. The plan was a surgical strike designed with mathematical cruelty. Every skyscraper has a natural frequency, a specific rhythm it sways to when the wind hits it just right. If I could sync the building's massive HVAC fans to pulse at that exact frequency, I could create a resonance event. The tower would begin to sway, not enough to fall, but enough to trigger every seismic alarm in the building. Julian's perfect masterpiece would be declared an active disaster zone on live television during his grandest night. What if the mechanical override kicks in before the sensors hit the threshold? I muttered to myself, tracing the schematics under a flickering desk lamp that smelled of hot metal. I gripped my father's silver drafting compass, the cold metal biting deep into my palm. I was standing on a moral precipice, looking down into a pit of my own making. If the panic turned into a stampede, their blood would be on my hands, just as much as Julian's. Is this really justice, or is it just my ego wanting to win one last fight? I asked the empty, shadowed room. I remembered my father's face at the end, the way his spirit withered when Julian stole his sketches and called them his own. I remembered the hollow, echoing sound of the cell door, sliding shut on my life. This wasn't just about my revenge. It was about the integrity of the foundation itself. It's both, I whispered. And it's the only way to make the math right again. I tapped the enter key, uploading the first line of the sequence to the building's remote server. There was no turning back now. The load was finally shifting toward the man who thought he could outrun gravity. Opening night of the Legacy Tower. The air was electric, thick with the scent of expensive perfume and rain, slicked asphalt. From my perch on the roof, I could hear the muffled roar of the orchestra 40 stories below. Everything is set, Elias. Sarah's voice crackled through my earpiece, thin and sharp against the wind. The frequency is locked. Are you sure about this? Once the resonance builds, there's no turning back. I looked at the giant intake fans of the HVAC system, spinning like the blades of a guillotine. Start the cycle, Sarah. Let the building tell the truth for once. I tapped the command on my tablet. The first vibration was subtle, a low, frequency thrum that you felt in your teeth before you heard it. It was the sound of a giant waking up. I watched the water in a discarded cup on the maintenance floor begin to ripple in perfect, geometric patterns. Within minutes, the thrum deepened into a growl. The massive steel cables holding the elevator counterweights began to hum like cello strings. In the lobby, Julian was likely mid-speech, unaware that the floor beneath him was starting to breathe. Initial phase complete, Sarah whispered. The seismic alarms are starting to flicker green. 10 more minutes and they'll go red. My heart was a frantic bird in my chest, but my hands were cold and steady. The math was finally in motion. The tower was ours now. While the resonance climbed, I accessed the encrypted folder Sarah had pulled from Julian's private cloud. One file stood out, a voice memo dated the night our father died. I hit play. The audio was grainy, distorted by the sound of wind and the screech of a construction site. You can't do this, Julian. My father's voice was a desperate rasp. The hub's integrity is compromised. I won't let you sign off on those beams. Then came Julian's voice, cold and devoid of any brotherly warmth. The name is worth more than the steel, Dad. You're old and you're tired. I'm saving us. A scuffle followed, the sound of heavy boots on metal. Let go of the ledge, Dad. Don't be a fool. My father's last words weren't a plea for his life, they were a warning. The truth. The truth will outlive us both, Julian. Then a terrifying silence, followed by the distant, sickening thud of impact. I sat on the cold concrete, my phone trembling in my hand. He hadn't just framed me for his fraud. He'd murdered our father to cover it up. The bitterness I'd carried for 3 years suddenly felt like an ocean. Julian didn't just deserve to lose his company, he deserved to lose his world. Elias, are you okay? Sarah asked. I couldn't answer. The sound of my father's death was a permanent scar on my mind, a structural failure that no revenge could ever truly fix. The heavy steel door to the roof slammed open with a sound like a gunshot. I expected a guard, but it was Julian himself, his tailored suit disheveled, his eyes wild with a frantic, animalistic fear. Behind him stood two men I didn't recognize, thick-necked and hollow-eyed. "Turn it off, Elias!" he screamed, his voice cracking. "I know it's you! I see the rig on the security feed!" Stop this madness before the city condemns the building. I stepped onto the edge of the window washing rig, the wind whipping my canvas jacket. The city should have condemned you a long time ago, Julian. I heard the recording. I know what happened on the bridge with Dad. Julian stopped, his face draining of color until he looked like a marble statue of a man. That was an accident, he stammered, his bravado crumbling like dry rot. He slipped. I tried to help him. You don't understand the pressure, the weight of the Thorn name. You didn't help him. You let the weight kill him so you could keep the profit. I said, my voice as cold as the altitude. He signaled the men. Get him. I don't care how, just get that tablet and shut it down. They lunged toward me. I kicked the release lever on the rig, and the platform dropped 10 feet with a stomach-turning lurch. I was dangling over the abyss, held by two fraying cables. The thugs hesitated at the ledge, looking down at the 400-foot drop. What are you waiting for? Julian roared. He's just a window washer! Kill him! One man tried to climb down the cable, his heavy boots kicking at the air. I grabbed my squeegee, a heavy brass-weighted tool, and swung it with every ounce of fury I possessed. It caught him in the knee, and he let out a howl of pain, retreating back to the safety of the roof. You're an architect of shadows, Julian! I yelled, the rig swinging violently in the gusts. But you forgot one thing. I know every bolt and bracket in this structure. I know which ones are weak, and I know exactly how much tension this cable can take before it snaps. I pulled a manual release pin. The rig tilted at a terrifying 45-degree angle. Come and get it, Julian! Or are you too afraid to stand on the foundation you built? He stood at the ledge, his hands white, knuckled on the railing. For the first time in 40 years, the golden sun looked small. He looked like a man realizing that gravity doesn't care about his name. He was trapped by his own arrogance, high above a city he thought he owned. This is the end of the Thorn Tower, I shouted, and I'm the only one who can stop the resonance. The vibrations were no longer a thrum. They were a physical assault that vibrated the marrow of my bones. As I descended from the roof through the maintenance hatch, the tower groaned around me, a 600-foot beast howling in a language of structural agony only I could truly speak. Dust fell from the ceiling like gray, toxic snow. Every joint, every weld, and every cheap grade 60 beam was screaming under the resonance I'd unleashed. I pushed through the service doors into the grand ballroom on the 40th floor. The scene was a masterclass in shattered elegance. The $3,000 crystal chandeliers were swinging in wide, violent arcs, their glass prisms tinkling like shattered ice before raining down on the marble. The elite of the city, men in silk and women in sequins, were clutching the walls, their faces pale with a primal terror as the floor beneath them bucked like a living thing. I didn't hide my face. I walked straight down the center of the room, my heavy work boots crunching on fallen crystal. I was covered in grease, sweat, and the grit of the rooftop struggle. I looked like a ghost that had crawled out of the city's plumbing to haunt a party. The contrast was a sharp, jagged edge. I was the hard reality in a room made of soft illusions and expensive lies. What are you doing? Is the building falling? A woman in a red gown shrieked, grabbing my sleeve. The foundation is shifting, I told her. I suggest you take the stairs. Gravity is currently reconsidering its contract with this family. I shook her off and kept moving toward the stage. Julian stood behind a podium of polished oak, looking like a man who had seen his own executioner. My mother stood beside him, her hand gripping the edge of the heavy table in sheer terror. Elias, stop this, she shouted over the mounting roar of the building. Think of the family name! Think of the Thorn reputation. I reached the stage and stared her down. I am thinking of the Thorn reputation, Mother. I'm thinking about the way it sounded when Dad hit the pavement after Julian pushed him. I'm thinking about the 3 years I spent in a cold cell, for a crime he committed. The name isn't a crown anymore. It's a structural failure that needs to be cleared out forever. I'm doing exactly what Dad would have wanted me to do today. I pulled the tablet from my belt and tapped the final override command. The massive 8K video walls behind the stage flickered once, then transformed. They didn't show the promotional video of the Thorn legacy. Instead, the audio of my father's final moments filled the room, amplified by 10,000 watts of surround sound. The sound of the wind, the heavy breathing, and the sickening thud echoed through the ballroom, louder than the groaning of the steel. "That's a lie! That's a fabrication!" Julian screamed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched wail. "Security! Someone kill the power!" "This is an act of terrorism." I stepped closer until I could smell the sour scent of his panic. "The power is slaved to the structural monitoring system now, Julian. And the whole city is watching the live feed. Every major news network is broadcasting your failure as we speak. Look at the screen." I switched the display to show the real, time-stress diagrams, where the primary supports are currently turning a deep, warning red across every single floor in this massive and failing building. "You used grade 60 scrap for the core, Julian," I said, my voice projecting through the room. "The shear force is at 98%. This building isn't a masterpiece, it's a vertical graveyard. You didn't just steal the firm's money, you stole the safety of every person in this ballroom." The crowd erupted into a tide of silk and diamonds rushing toward the stairs. Julian tried to follow them, but his legs gave out. He collapsed against the podium, a broken man in an expensive suit. "You've destroyed us," he whispered. "Everything Dad worked for. It's all gone." "Dad didn't build this, Julian," I said, leaning down. "He built things that lasted. You built things that looked good in a brochure. There's a difference between architecture and marketing. You aren't an architect, you're just a thief in a silk tie." I looked at my mother. She wasn't crying. She was just staring at the screen, at the record of her favorite son's murder of her husband. For the first time, she looked old, fragile, and utterly defeated by the weight of her own prideful, toxic choices. "What happens to the firm now? What happens to the Thorn name?" she asked, her voice a ghost of its former power. "Now, the sirens start," I said. On cue, the building's primary disaster alarm began to wail, a deep, booming klaxon. The emergency lights bathed the room in a rhythmic, bloody red. A massive crack snaked across the marble floor between us, a literal divide in our history. I turned my back on them. I walked through the chaos toward the service stairs, shifting the load off my heart and breathing for the first time in 3 long years today. "The math says it'll hold for another 40 minutes, Julian." I called back without turning. "That's plenty of time for the police to find you." I hit the stairwell, the silence of the concrete shaft a relief. The tension was gone. The tower was stable again. The cancer had finally been cut out, and the truth was standing. My revenge was as solid as a foundation of rock. I didn't look back at all now. I took the first step down. I finally had my soul. The math was perfect. My work was done. I walked out past the police line, the blue and red lights painting the wet pavement in rhythmic, neon pulses. The city air felt different, thinner, colder, but finally breathable. For 3 years, I had lived with the weight of that tower pressing down on my lungs, a phantom, crushing load that never let me sleep. Now, it was just a building again. People often ask me if revenge tastes sweet. They're wrong. It tastes like copper and old charcoal. It's a caustic cleaning agent that strips away the grime of the past, but it takes a layer of your soul with it. The truth doesn't just set you free, it strips you bare. I looked at my hands under the yellow, buzzing hum of a street lamp. They were scarred, rough, and stained with the grease of the rig, but they were finally clean of the Thorn signature. I had lost my license, my fortune, and the woman I thought I'd grow old with. But I had found the math I'd lost in that crowded courtroom. The world isn't a fair place, and people will always find a way to lie to themselves. But gravity is an honest judge. I sat on a damp park bench and watched the tow trucks hauling away the wreckage of Julian's fleet. My brother was headed for a concrete cell far smaller than the one he'd put me in. And my mother was headed for a silence she couldn't fill with dinner parties. I had dismantled the Thorn legacy to save the family soul. It was a heavy trade, but the math finally added up. 2 weeks later, I went to see my mother. She wasn't at the estate, the bank had seized the grounds, and the house to pay off Julian's mounting civil suits. She was in a cramped two-bedroom apartment in a part of the city she used to refer to as unfortunate. The hallways smelled of boiled cabbage and cheap detergent. When she opened the door, she was wearing a cashmere sweater that looked entirely out of place against the stained linoleum. "Elias," she said, her voice thin and brittle. "I didn't think you'd come to see me." "I'm not here for a reunion, Mother," I said, staying in the hallway. I handed her a small cardboard box. It contained my father's drafting tools, the ones Julian hadn't managed to pawn for bribe money. "The lawyers say Julian is facing 25 years," she whispered, her eyes red and sunken. "They're calling it the legacy fraud. Everything we spent over 50 years building. It's just mud and headlines now. Why couldn't you have just talked to us, Elias? We were a family." "I did talk to you," I said. "I talked to you with blueprints and math and warnings. You told me that appearances were the only thing that mattered. Well, this is what the truth looks like when you strip away facade. It's ugly, isn't it?" Eleanor sat down. She looked down at the box, her fingers tracing the worn leather case of the tools. "What will you do now? You have nothing left." "I have exactly what I started with," I told her. "A pencil and the facts. I'm going to build something that doesn't need a lie to stay standing." "Goodbye, Eleanor." As I walked down the echoing stairwell, I didn't feel the old, burning anger, finally realizing that the foundation had been rotten from the start. I found a small, drafty studio in the industrial district, right on the edge of the river. It's just one room with a massive window that lets in a steady, honest light. There are no skyscrapers here. I can hear the water lapping against the wood pilings. I spend my days at a drafting table I built myself out of reclaimed timber. I'm designing a small footbridge for a park. It's a simple suspension design. It won't win awards, but it is structurally perfect. Every bolt is triple checked. My mind no longer has to hide. Sometimes Sarah stops by. "The tide is high today," she remarked, leaning against the frame. "Water doesn't lie," I replied. "We talk about the light on the river." She's working for a non-profit now. I picked up my father's drafting compass today. I drew a perfect circle on the vellum. The graphite moved with a soft hiss. The weight was finally off. I've learned that seeking revenge, even when it's justified, comes with a price I'll carry forever. If this story touched you, I'd really appreciate a like and subscribe. It helps me share these experiences. Thanks for listening.